Do you feel a shiver up your spine from fear? Yes, it's another story from the Nightshade diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind. Amp up your imagination and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. Further stories from Lord Halifax, the Countess Belvedere. The story of the Countess Belvedere appears in the Ghost Book without any indication of how or from whom Lord Halifax obtained it. It is not a ghost story at all, but was the kind of tale which never failed to delight him both for its strangeness and for the fact that it dealt with the history of families with which he was acquainted. His friend, Mr. Athelstan Riley, married the daughter of the 8th Count Molesworth, a descendant of the father of the Countess of Belvedere. Mary Molesworth was the eldest daughter by a first marriage of Richard, 3rd Viscount Molesworth, an officer of distinguished bravery who had been aide-de-camp to the Duke of Marlborough at the Battle of Ramillies. After having attained the rank of Major General, he retired from active service and held many high and important situations in Ireland. For many years he was Commander-in-Chief in that country, residing with his family in Dublin. It was during his tenure of the command that his eldest daughter, Mary, attracted the regard of a Mr. Rochfort, a gentleman of a very ancient and honourable family in County Westmeath. He is described as a man of considerable talent and ability with expensive taste and the most polished manners, but as being at the same time possessed of a haughty and vindictive temper, selfish, unprincipled, and dissipated in his way of living. At the date when he met Miss Molesworth he was 28, a widower and childless, his first wife having died a few months after the marriage. He had some interest in high places in England, a circumstance which possibly commended his suit to Lord Molesworth, who, besides being charmed by his excellent manners, was sufficiently worldly to encourage the address of a man for whom honour and advancement might reasonably be anticipated. Indeed, at this time Mr. Rochfort was considered a most promising young man, and was so much in favour with the reigning monarch George II that he was soon to be created Baron Belfield, and a little later a Viscount. Eventually he became Earl of Belvedere, and as it is by this title that he is best known, he will be so termed throughout this narrative. He was a man of striking and handsome appearance. The only portrait of him extant shows him at a comparatively advanced age, when he was no longer a smiling and successful courtier, but had begun to show in his features the working of the hand of time. He is in his parliamentary robes, tall, dark, and handsome, but with a stern, gloomy, and saturnine expression on his face. Probably his appearance had altered since the days when he paid his court to Miss Molesworth, and a milder manner and a more amiable temper would be expected of him. She at this time was only 16, an attractive and accomplished girl with a gentle and thoughtful disposition. She seems to have been not altogether unaware of her suitor's true qualities. She saw in him a man who might well adorn a court, but was less likely to make his own family happy. She had observed that, kind and attentive as he invariably was towards herself, he was haughty and inconsiderate towards others, and the prospect of marrying him gave her little pleasure. However, she was only 16, too young and too gentle to offer much resistance to a match which all around her were pressing on her. With many forebodings she at length gave her consent, the marriage taking place in August 1st, 1736. It is said that just before its celebration she sat for her picture, and that when it was suggested that she should be painted in some fancy costume, she chose one which, especially in the shape of the coiffure, recalled the well-known portrait of that ill-fated captive, her namesake, Queen Mary of Scotland. In a very short time Lady Belvedere's foreboding began to be realized in the coldness and neglect of her husband. He was surrounded by flatterers who, for reasons of their own, had opposed his marriage, and were now on the watch to prejudice him against his young wife. There was a woman in particular who was her persistent and mischievous enemy, and to whom she afterwards attributed most of her misfortunes. Having enjoyed for some time a strong influence over Lord Belvedere, the woman was naturally jealous of his young wife. Although a year after the marriage, Lady Belvedere disappointed her husband's hope for an heir by giving birth to a daughter, in due course she presented him with a son, a fine and promising child, and it may be supposed that for a time at least Lord Belvedere's affection for his wife revived. The birth of the heir was magnificently celebrated, the child being christened George Augustus after the king, who stood godfather by proxy and continued, until his death more than 20 years later, to be a firm friend to the child's father. During the first years of their married life, the Belvederes mostly resided at Galston in County Westmeath, and here, in course of time, 2 other sons were born to them. The house was large, gloomy, dating from the days of Edward III. Later it belonged to Chief Baron Rochfort, and is alluded to by Dean Swift. Such painful associations were to gather around it that the second and last Earl of Belvedere sold the house to Lord Kilmaine, who replaced it with a more modern and less forbidding structure. As might be expected, a rural domestic life had little attraction for Lord Belvedere. His absences were long and frequent, most of his time being spent either at the English court or in Dublin, which in the days before the Union had its own parliament, and was the residence of the Irish aristocracy. Fortunately for Lady Belvedere, she preferred a quiet life in the country. She was a fond and attentive mother, and in the care and society of her children she was able to forget the estrangement from her husband. The 3 boys were still in their infancy, but the daughter was beginning to be of a companionable age. Afterwards Countess of Lanesborough, the girl gave early promise of that affection, gaiety, and beauty for which she was to be distinguished. As time went on, the visits of Lord Belvedere to his wife and family became rarer and shorter, and when they occurred they added little to the happiness of the house. There was a gloom on his brow and a severity in his manner which filled his wife with fears for the future. She was convinced that his old friends and flatterers, and in particular her own enemy, had been poisoning his mind against her. Nothing else could explain his suspicious looks and savage tones. 8 years after the marriage, the storm broke. Lord Belvedere appeared at Galston and charged his wife with having been unfaithful to him, the partner of her guilt being alleged to be a relative of his own. The accounts which have survived state that Lady Belvedere at first received this accusation with surprise and anger, but that at last in desperation she astonished her friends by acknowledging her guilt. She was in fact entirely innocent, but having failed to conquer her husband's suspicions, she hoped to strengthen the grounds for a divorce, and so rid herself of a man whom she now found it impossible not to hate. Subsequently she repeatedly protested her innocence, and on her deathbed, some 30 years later, made a solemn oath to that effect. The other party named was a married man, of exemplary character, an affectionate father, and a most attached husband. He and his wife were both sincerely sorry for their young and neglected neighbor, whose husband's profligacies were well known to them. Living as they did close to Galston, there was a constant intercourse between the 2 houses. Lady Belvedere knew that she would always find a ready and sympathetic welcome in the home of her friends, and it may well be that in their company she did not always resist the temptation of dwelling upon her unhappiness. The charge of infidelity was followed by proceedings in court. The principal witness was Lady Belvedere's enemy, who had laid her plans so well that damages to the amount of £20,000 were awarded the Earl, whereupon the ill-fated defendant, unable to meet so formidable a demand, fled the country. After residing abroad for many years, his Irish property being meanwhile neglected, and his sole comfort being the society of his attached wife and family, he was induced to return with them to Ireland, believing that lapse of time would have softened Lord Belvedere's heart. It was a vain hope. He was arrested and sent to prison, where eventually he died protesting to the last his innocence of the charge against him. Meanwhile, Lady Belvedere had discovered that her hopes of obtaining a divorce from her husband were illusory. Latterly, he had spent little time at Galston, now he determined to abandon it altogether. The house was old and inconvenient, and the property, apart from the gardens, which were very fine, had little to recommend it to a man of his taste. He accordingly removed his establishment to a beautiful mansion some few miles away. It was a new house, immediately adjoining the demesne of Rochfort, the residence of a collateral branch of his family. The name of Rochfort is now almost extinct in the neighbourhood, but was at one time well known and esteemed. A member of the family representing Westmeath in Parliament for many years. Between Rochfort and Lord Belvedere's new house lies the artificial ruin of an abbey, the tradition being that this building arose out of a family feud. The ruin was actually built by Lord Belvedere himself and was a further illustration of his vindictive nature. He had quarrelled with his younger brother, who lived at Rochford, and wanted to be spared the annoyance of seeing the other's house when he looked out of his windows. So at a great expense he built the ruined abbey, fetching over for the purpose from Italy a celebrated Florentine architect. But when Lord Belvedere moved from Galston, he had no intention of taking his wife with him. She was to remain, and her house was to be her asylum or prison. Here he could keep her under close surveillance, and such was his influence throughout the countryside that he had no lack of allies to help him to carry out his detestable plan. Lady Belvedere was accordingly closely confined to Galston, forbidden visitors and restricted in her movements. Otherwise she appears at first to have been treated reasonably well. She had sufficient servants, the use of a carriage for driving about the extensive grounds, and all the clothes she required. It is said that drawing was her favorite occupation, and for this she was given every facility. She was also allowed to write letters, and it is a mystery why she did not complain of her treatment to her family or her friends, or if she did, why they took no steps to help her. Perhaps they feared to interfere between man and wife, and probably Lord Belvedere had taken the precaution of giving his father-in-law a version of his daughter's conduct, such as would persuade him that strict seclusion was the only way in which further disgrace to the family might be avoided. It may be added that very soon after the confinement took place, Lady Belvedere's mother, who might have exercised her influence in her daughter's favour, died, whereupon Lord Molesworth took to himself a second wife, who presented him with a large and increasing family. What at least is certain is that Lady Belvedere's relatives took no steps whatever to procure her liberation. One consolation was at first allowed her. She was permitted from time to see her children, who were and continued to be deeply attached to her. The years began to slip by. At the date of her confinement, Lady Belvedere was not quite 25, and as she grew older, her desire for emancipation became stronger. Doubtless she repeatedly appealed by letter to her husband. If she did, her efforts were quite unavailing. He would not even see her, though he paid frequent visits to the grounds and gardens of Galston. One day, however, fortune seemed to favour her. Lord Belvedere unexpectedly entered the garden without having taken his usual precautions against seeing his wife. Unhappily, he was accompanied by one of those friends who were especially hostile to Lady Belvedere. The latter, however, seeing her husband approach, rushed forward and threw herself on her knees before him. She would not ask forgiveness for a crime she had not committed, but in a few hurried words she told of the hardness of her lot, and begged to be released. So moving was her appeal that for a moment Lord Belvedere was shaking in his resolution, but only for a moment. His friend, without allowing him time to reply, turned reproachfully to him with the words, "Remember your honour, my lord," and drew him from the spot. From that time onward, Lord Belvedere hardened in his attitude. So far from modifying the treatment of his wife, he increased the restrictions on her liberty. She was allowed to walk in a certain portion of the demesne only, and at such times a person was appointed to accompany her. Her attendant was given a bell, which he was instructed to ring when he and his charge were taking the air, so that everyone might know they were about and avoid them. After 12 years of captivity, the lady at length succeeded, with the help of some faithful servants, in making her escape from Galston. How she got away is not known, but the news was quickly taken to her husband, who, anticipating that she would seek the shelter of her father's house in Dublin, took immediate steps to forestall her. Lord Molesworth was then living on the south side of Merrion Square, and Lord Belvedere, reaching the house before his wife could arrive, worked so powerfully upon the feelings of his father-in-law that the latter gave strict orders for his daughter to be refused admittance. Poor Lady Belvedere was completely overwhelmed by such a reception. At her wits' end, and thinking of no danger but the chance of recapture, she took the one step that would be fatal to her. She gave her coachman orders to drive to Sackville Street, where resided the wife and family of the man now dead, with whom she was supposed to have misconducted herself. There, if anywhere, she believed herself sure of a welcome. Whether she ever got to her friends or not, we do not know. She was, however, followed, and Lord Belvedere's rage on discovering her destination may be imagined. She was seized, and within less than 24 hours after she had left Galston, she was back in her prison again. In future, treatment was to be greatly altered. She was deprived of her comforts. The servants who had been too sympathetic with her were dismissed. She was not allowed to see her children, and even her little amusements and occupations were forbidden her. In fact, she was reduced to the bare necessities of life, and surrounded by a set of attendants who treated her harshly and were constantly on the watch, lest she should elude their vigilance. But indeed she had guessed what her capture would entail for her. It is stated that immediately after her unsuccessful flight, her hair turned white in the course of a single night. She endured this rigorous imprisonment for no less than 18 years. It is hard to believe that this could have been possible in a civilized country during the 18th century. It is equally surprising that her reason did not give way under her treatment. There was indeed a general, though erroneous, idea abroad, fostered probably by her husband, that her mind had become deranged. We have no exact account of how she passed her time. A few particulars, however, have reached us. One informant was an old and valued servant who lived and died with the Rochford family. He was at one time a footman at Galston, the only one of the old staff who was allowed to remain after Lady Belvedere's attempted escape. As it was, he stayed until the day of her release. When he was a very old man and his memory, particularly of recent occurrences, was beginning to fail, he could still recall with energy and feeling every circumstance connected with his unhappy mistress. He would relate how she would ask him anxiously for news of her children or of what was happening in the country. The children, however, were her chief concern, and the footman was the only person from whom she dared to ask for information of them. Many a time, he said, when he was seeking to the fire, she would purposely delay him in his task, so as to prolong the conversation. At other times, he would see her walking in the picture gallery and gazing at the portraits as though she were trying to talk to them. When Lady Belvedere had almost abandoned hope, the hour of her release arrived. In November 1774, Lord Belvedere died in the 66th year of his age, heavily in debt and regretted by few. No sooner was her funeral over than her eldest son, accompanied by his brothers, hastened to Galston to set their mother at liberty. 18 years had wrought great changes in all parties, and especially in poor Lady Belvedere. She had, we are told, become prematurely old and haggard, had a scared, unearthly look, and spoke in a harsh, agitated whisper. When her sons arrived, they found her wearing the fashions of 30 years back, when her imprisonment began. As they entered the room, she was at first speechless and faltered, "Is the tyrant dead?" Her sons, of course, were now fully grown, the eldest being in the prime of life, and so strong was the family likeness between him and his brothers that their mother was compelled to ask which was the new Lord Belvedere. They took her from Galston at once. The eldest son, who had just married, was about to travel to Italy with his wife, and thinking a complete change of scene might benefit his mother, proposed that she should accompany them. This well-meant plan failed on its object. The excitement of a journey was too much for one so long accustomed to solitude. Eventually it was arranged that while Lord Belvedere and his young wife went on to Italy, his mother would stay at a convent in France, and it has been erroneously stated that she died there, having first joined the Roman Catholic Church. The truth is that after spending the winter in Florence, Lord Belvedere returned for his mother and took her to London, where for 12 months she stayed with a friend of the family who had apartments at Kensington Palace. Her long imprisonment had so impaired her nerves that she now sought solitude and shunned the company of all but her nearest relations. Her dread of appearing in public was not irrational. Her story had begun to attract attention and was circulating round London in different versions, some less charitable than others, while the strangeness of her appearance made her an object of curiosity wherever she went. All that kindness and care could do for her was done, but her disquiet increased, and after the death of one of her younger sons, she wrote to Lord Belvedere and expressed a wish that she might return to Ireland. She spent the remainder of her life in Dublin, first with her eldest son and afterwards with her son-in-law and daughter, Lord and Lady Lanesborough. So she ended her days in peace, surrounded by her grandchildren, and on her deathbed, after receiving Holy Communion, she confirmed, with a most solemn oath, her innocence of the offense for which she has suffered so long a captivity. The Restless Dead. This story was taken from Blackwood's magazine for December 1892. 5 years before the date of this story, George Woodfall, a wealthy and respected citizen of Sydney, beloved of all classes for his uprightness and benevolence, suddenly vanished, leaving not the faintest trace. His disappearance caused the most profound sensation, and as his affairs were found to be in perfect order, foul play was for a time suspected. No clue, however, was forthcoming, and after 2 years a monument was raised to the man who had earned the right to be called a public benefactor. My name is Power, the Reverend Charles Power. I am the incumbent of the parish church at St. Chrysostom, Redfern, Sydney, and though a clergyman, I have never so far been led to suspect myself of being in any way a weakling, or given over to vain imaginings. I am 40 years of age and unmarried. My life has been uniformly practical, and I cannot remember to have ever been the prey of any morbid sentiment whatever. Hitherto I have utterly disbelieved in apparitions of any description, regarding them as illusions presented to a temporarily though slightly disordered brain, and I am free to confess that, had I been alone the witness of this apparition herein described, I should have felt bound to set aside my own impressions as unworthy of serious attention, on the grounds already stated, nor should I have further investigated the matter, and thus what is now known might never have come to light, and for all we know rest and peace might have been denied to a long tortured soul. Thus much of myself. Of my friend William Raleigh, I may say that he is a man of like mind unto myself, that as a scientist, famous throughout the world as the man who planned and carried out the canal system of New South Wales, his education has not been such as to render him fanciful, even did his natural instincts turn in that direction, which they do not. In a word, he is a hard-headed, shrewd, and utterly unimaginative man. One thing must be stated at the outset. The exact locality in which the events here recorded came to pass we have concealed, fearing lest some too curious hand might disturb that lonely grave among the mountains, where lies all that remains of a man who, if he sinned, surely also suffered. With what amazed horror the inhabitants of the city of Sydney will learn the fate of George Woodfall, we can well imagine. When a man respected and beloved among us for 20 years departed suddenly from our midst, the whole community mourned for him as for a father, and now, when the veil is rent, and he whom we believed a saint stands revealed the opposite of all we once conceived him to be, amazement is only natural. But lest that feeling should change in the minds of some to that of scorn, I would say, judge him not, for you know not how he was tempted. Judge him not until you have been tempted even as he was, and then if you resist, still judge him not, because of the awfulness of his doom. The actual narrative of our experience I shall leave to William Rowley, whose powers of description, as I find on comparing our two separately compiled statements, considerably surpass my own. In the month of September last year, my friend Power and I were shaking the cobwebs from our brains and enjoying a short holiday among the mountains of the Great Dividing Range. I shall not, as Power says, indicate more nearly the precise locality to any but those who may have a personal or public right to the information. We had been out about a fortnight, and Power, who was an enthusiastic botanist, had already made several new discoveries among the Australian flora, while I, gun in hand, contented myself with bringing down that particular section of the fauna most directly concerned with our breakfast and dinner. One evening, it was the 20th, and the date is indelibly engraved on my memory, when we were in the very heart of the lofty ranges, we began to cast about for a spot where we could camp for the night. Not far away, we could hear the thunder of a waterfall, and judging that we should find what we wanted somewhere in its vicinity, we pressed on, descending deeper and deeper into a long gully, the sides of which were thickly covered with tall trees and tangled undergrowth. On reaching the bottom, we walked forward till we came upon a pretty glade, formed by clumps of tall tree ferns, fringing a deep pool, which was formed in part at least by the water which poured incessantly from the heights, and constituted the head of a small creek, which flowed away and was soon lost to sight among the dense foliage through which it forced its way. This was the very spot for us, and during our supper we found leisure to observe the formation of the waterfall, exactly opposite to which we reclined. It was very curious. From the top of the cliff, the water projected by some force, the nature of which we could not divine, sprang sheer up from the brink of the precipice, and descending in a mighty and unbroken arc, poured with a never-ceasing roar upon a great ledge of rock, which jutted out some 40 feet below. Here, after having been collected, as it were, in a vast reservoir, it continuously overflowed and rushed down the black face of the rock in a torrent of silver foam. Scarcely had we finished our supper, and piling a few logs on the fire, lit our pipes for a yarn, and then suddenly it seemed the clear starry sky became overcast. A violent gust of wind rushed shrieking through the gully, scattering our fire in all directions, ceased, and for a few moments all was still. Then drip, drip, fell splashing a few heavy drops of rain, and almost before we could reach the shelter of the nearest clump of ferns, a tremendous storm burst upon us with a fury which, notwithstanding my long experience of tropical storms, I have never seen surpassed. The wind had died away, but the thunder rolled and crashed and reverberated in an awful manner. All the time, writhing and coiling, and darting with forked tongues about the topmost summits, gleamed the electric fires, like a multitude of blazing serpents let loose upon the blackness of the night. From the shelter, such as it was, where we crouched, Power and I watched the progress of the storm. So pitchy dark had it grown that though touching we could not see one another, and though we heard its never-ceasing rush even above the fury of the storm, the great white mass of falling water immediately in front of us had become invisible. Suddenly a leaden streak flashed out of the gloom, struck for one instant the face of the cliff with a broad blaze of light, then vanished, leaving all once more in darkness. No, not all, for through the intense blackness there arose, just in the position of the watery arc, a soft and luminous mist. Faint and shadowy at first, it rapidly increased in density, becoming dearer to the sight till at length it hung, as it were, a great white pall suspended between heaven and hell. Crash, and another stunning thunder roll shook the air, while again the forked flame darted its fiery shaft upon the face of the cliff. Then darkness once more, save for the misty veil, now no longer white, but suffused with a pale pink glow, delicate and fleeting as the first faint flush of dawn. Swiftly it deepened to an exquisite tint, while thousands upon thousands of rosy drops were flung hither and thither as the spray from the ledge was splashed and dashed in all directions. But beautiful as this was, scant time was left to us to admire it. Another crash, another flash, a roaring, rumbling noise, as if an earthquake was upon us, and once again the scene was changed. There was one brief interval of perfect stillness, and then in an instant the pink glow went out. Darkness while one might draw breath, and then a blood-red glare so intense, so lurid, that it required but little imagination to suppose a torrent of blood descending on us where we sat. Out curved the great arc in a vast sheet of crimson, and down the black face of the cliff poured the red stream in all manner of fantastic shapes. But now the light was not confined to the water alone, for the whole mountain glared and glowed, and the giant tree seemed to reel in desperate conflict. Then as suddenly as it had come, the glorious display vanished, and thick darkness settled once more upon everything. Hitherto we had watched in silence, too absorbed in the grandeur of what we saw for speech. But now I turned to Power with a light remark about our good fortune and having witnessed such a phenomenon. As I spoke, I felt him grasp my arm convulsively. "My God," he said in a voice so unlike his own I scarcely knew it. "What is that?" "What?" I exclaimed, rather startled by the tone in which he spoke. He did not answer, but his grasp tightened on my arm. I looked in the direction of the waterfall. Heavens, what was it? Out of the gloom, high up in the midst of the arc of water, peered a human hand. It was the hand of a dead man, long and lean, with a blue decaying flesh shriveling on the fingers. And as it waved and beckoned, another hand, withered and gruesome, like itself, grew before our eyes, and long thin fingers twined themselves together as if in supplication. Struggling as it were into material shape followed the arms, and then, as I sat, my mouth agape with horror and every nerve tingling, there in ghastly completeness stood a man. But what a man! He had been dead for years. On his bones the flesh had shrunk and dried and in some parts rotted off. It was a man, yet not a man. A skeleton, yet not a skeleton. A horrid corpse endowed with life, or at least with a semblance of life. And now a great blaze of crimson light burst forth again, and all over the figure and about and around it seemed to flow streams of blood. The awful thing writhed and rocked in what seemed to be a deadly paroxysm of anguish, now standing erect and flinging its weird arms above its head, as though invoking curses, now falling on its withered knees in agony. I could bear no more and hid my face in my hands. When I looked again, the apparition had vanished. "Power," I said falteringly. There was no answer. He had fainted. When he came to, the moon was again shining high in the heavens. There was no trace of the recent storm, and the cataract was a broad and gleaming sheet of silver, as though nothing had ever happened to disturb it. Power stretched himself, rubbed his eyes, then sat up and looked about him in a bewildered way. At last he spoke. "Rowley," he began hesitatingly, "I've had a very curious dream. I I thought it best to cut him short. It was no dream, Power," I said, for I saw it too. He looked at me for a moment incredulously, then covered his face with his hands. "You saw it too?" he gasped. "Then, my God, what can it mean?" Power is a cool and remarkably self-possessed man, and before very long his nerves recovered their balance and he spoke to me again. "Of one thing I am firmly convinced," he said. "So terrifying a spectacle would never have been allowed to appear to us without some reason. What do you suppose it to be?" "Really," I answered, "I have no idea and prefer not to imagine. We must go up there and try to find out." "My own thought," he said, rising to his feet. "Come." "What, now?" I cried in astonishment. "Surely you will wait till morning. There is nothing to be gained by such haste, or to be lost by a little delay." "That may or may not be," he replied firmly. "All I know is that I am going to try to get behind that veil of water tonight. Could you sleep," he added with a faint smile, "while there was a possibility of that ghastly thing appearing to us again?" I could not. "There's not much chance of that," I admitted. "To tell you the truth, I rather wish it would, for then we might arrive at some scientific explanation of it. I was so shaken by the surprise when the gentleman made his first appearance that I—" "Rowley," he interrupted, "don't jest. We do not agree on all points, and your belief in the unseen is much weaker than I would have it. But here, we have both of us had evidence of the most startling and convincing kind. Believe me, there is a meaning in this, and it is our plain duty to discover it if we can. Let us go now while we have the moon to light us." "All right," I said, "go ahead." And so we began the ascent together. There's no need to set down all the details of that weary climb. It was about 9:30 when we began it, and 11 when we reached the level of the rock on which the arc of water broke. A chasm lay between us, and it looked as we could see a dry wall of rock receding away from the water and leaving a wide passage, along which we could see from one end to the other. "That looks like a cave of some sort," said Power. "Can't we reach it?" "Not without jumping that chasm," I replied. "A feat I, for one, am not going to attempt. Let us see what can be done from the top." It took us another hour to reach the summit, and once there we saw we were no better off than before, for the water flung itself with a furious rush over the brow of the limestone cliff, while on each side the sheer face of the precipice precluded any idea of descending that way. "There must be an entrance somewhere," I said. "Let us set to work to find it." I then cut down a stout young sapling and began to lay about me with a will. "Whatever are you doing?" cried Power. "Knocking down the brushwood and trying to find the entrance, if there is one, to that cave." "Nonsense. If there were a hole, you would have fallen through it long ago. Depend upon it, if there is any entrance at all from above, it is much further away than this." With that, Power turned his back on me and disappeared among the rocks which covered the summit. Presently I heard him cooey. I answered and followed the direction of his voice. Found him less than 300 yards away and almost in a straight line from where we had been standing. "Well," I asked, "have you found anything?" "Yes," he replied, "but I don't know how much it means." And he pointed to a blaze on a fallen iron-bark tree by which he stood, under which a broad arrow pointed directly downwards. "A government surveyor's mark, probably," I said. "However, we'll see." Once again I set to work, beating down the brushwood with my sapling. It took some time to clear away the bushes that had grown up under and over the arc of the fallen tree, but at last it was done. And stooping down, I began a thorough examination of the place. Beginning at one end of the tree, I went carefully towards the other, thrusting my pole in all directions. When I had covered about 2/3 of the distance, I gave a sharp exclamation. "Give me the lantern," I cried. "What is it?" asked Power, his voice trembling with excitement as he hastily unslung and handed me a small bull's-eye lantern which he carried, and for which, on account of the brilliance of the moon, we had hitherto found no use. "I'll tell you when I know myself," I answered, and taking the lantern I flashed a light into the mouth of a great hole my attack on the shrubs had laid bare. Power leaning over me and trying to peer into it. "That is the way down," he said. "Not a doubt of it." I returned. "Come along." He started back. "You're never going down there," he gasped. "Yes, I am," I answered. "I'm going to see this thing through, now that we have got so far. Come on. You don't mean to let me go down alone? Of course not, replied Power, pulling himself together. But how are you going to get down? You don't know the depth of the hole. No, but I'll soon find out. Look here. All the time I had been talking, I had been clearing the undergrowth from the mouth of the hole and thrusting my pole down to find it, if possibly its depth. This I could not do, but struck by the fact that something hard projected at regular intervals from one side of the shaft, I concluded that the descent must have been made by a series of stakes driven into the earth. I verified this by leaning over the hole and thrusting my arms down till my knuckles came into contact with the first rung of the ladder, if it may be called so. I pointed this out to Power. Well, what are you going to do now? He asked. For answer, I laid my sapling across the mouth of the pole, and swinging myself into it, found as I expected that my feet rested on a second support about half my own length lower down. Another step, another and another, and my feet touched ground, so suddenly that I fell in a heap with an involuntary shout. Are you all right, Will? Asked Power anxiously from the top. Yes, at least I think so, but pass the light down. Power tied his handkerchief to the strap of the lantern and lowered it down to me, joining me himself a moment later. We're in for it now, Will, he said. Yes, I replied. We'll not go back, but the sapling may be useful. And swinging myself up once more, I drew in the long staff, and planting it on the ground below, sprang down again to Power's side. He flashed the light hither and thither, and we could see that we stood at the beginning of a long and fairly broad passage, the extent of which we could not guess. Listen, said Power suddenly. What's that? I'm not a very nervous man, but that startled ejaculation was something trying in the circumstances, and so I told Power. But I did hear something, Will, he said, apologetically. Of course you did, I replied. It was only the waterfall. This was true, for we could distinctly hear the thunder of the water. I was leading with a lantern and feeling doubtful of Power's nerves. I suggested leaving him behind and going on alone. How do you feel, Charles? I asked him. If you wait here, I'll go on by myself. This suggestion had the effect of bracing his nerves. Thank you, he replied. I don't feel very happy, I admit, but anything is better than being left here by myself. We can't see anything worse than we've seen already. Go on. We went forward cautiously till presently we were brought to a standstill by what seemed to be a solid wall of rock, barring our further progress. We soon saw, however, that what appeared to be a complete wall was merely a partition between the passage in which we stood and another passage, or perhaps a cave beyond. The communication was established by means of a natural archway, more than large enough to admit a man crawling on his hands and knees. Power went through first, while I guided his movements as well as I could with the lantern. Presently he called out. Are you through? I cried, almost immediately behind him. Yes, he answered, and I've found something too. What is it? I asked. I don't know exactly. It feels like a bundle of sticks tied together. As soon as I had crawled through, the lantern settled the question. What Power had found was a bundle of torches. This decides one point, I explained, drawing one out. We are not the first to visit this mysterious place. Let us light a torch and see better where we are. The first few torches, being damp and moldy with age, refused to light, but at last I succeeded with two from the center of the bundle. We each took one, holding them high above our heads. For a moment we were dazzled, then a wonderful sight met our eyes. We were in a vast limestone cavern. In front of us rose the grandest array of stalactites and stalagmites I had ever seen, stretching away in innumerable aisles, as it were the nave of some mighty cathedral. From the roof, between the great pillars, depended the most exquisite tracery of quartz. From prisms here and there the light from the torches was flashed back in many-colored waves. For a while we stood silent. At last Power said in an odd voice, We shall never see anything more marvelous than this. Let us go on, I replied. We had moved forward for perhaps 100 yards, the sound of the falling waters increasing at every step, when what was it were the nave of the cathedral with its rows of pillars came to an abrupt end, and in front of us at right angles ran another row of columns, resembling an exquisitely wrought choir screen. Wonders will never cease, remarked Power. It really would not surprise me to find an altar on the other side of that screen. Isn't it beautiful? Very, I replied, and very annoying too. It completely bars our way in this direction. Perhaps there is an opening somewhere, he suggested, and moved off to the left. I took a few paces in the opposite direction, and presently cried out, You're right. Here is the opening, and it's an artificial one. I pointed to a large and ragged hole in the screen. Look at that. It has been smashed to pieces with a hammer, or some such instrument. Not a doubt of it, Power agreed. But it must have been broken long ago, for there are traces of a new formation in progress. What is beyond? Another cave not so large, I replied, having already passed through the aperture. And beyond that is the waterfall, not 60 feet away. There is nothing here. I can see all around. Let us... Oh! The exclamation was wrung from me by a sudden spasm of terror, which shook me from head to foot. I fell back against Power with such violence as nearly to upset him, and then clung to him trembling. Quick! Let us go back. Don't look. This is no place for us. Flesh and blood cannot stand any more, I gasped. For heaven's sake, old man. What's the matter? Cried Power. Here, drink this. He handed me his flask. The spirit revived me, and with a violent effort I collected my wits again. Take some yourself, Charles, I urged. You will need it. He did so. Tell me what it is, he demanded. Holding my torch in my left hand, I pointed straight in front of me with my right. Power's eyes followed my finger. His torch dropped from his hand, and I flung my arm around him just in time to save him from falling. My God, he cried, how awful. Immediately in front of us yawned an open grave. The earth flung up on either side of it had grown hard and caked in the years that had rolled by since it was dug, and almost turned to stone by the ceaseless drip of water from the roof. At one end lay a pick and shovel carelessly cast aside. At the other two were fleshless, grinning skeletons, in such a position that they seemed to be peering into the grave beneath them. The light of the torches played on the ghastly forms, throwing flickering shadows upon them, until they looked like a pair of mocking demons, laughing into the nethermost pit. Let us go, cried Power. No, no, I said, in an unsteady voice. They cannot harm us. They are dead. Let us examine the grave. Not while they are keeping guard over it, protested Power. With one sweep of my sapling, I thrust back the ghastly pair, and they fell crumbling into dust by the side of the grave. We then peered into the open shaft. Our torches drooped forward to throw in the light. There in the grave were two forms that had once been human. The upper skeleton, such as we had just removed, hid the form that lay below it, a form which, though emaciated and in the last stages of decay, preserved some lingering likeness to humanity. With a determined effort, I thrust forward my sapling, when the hideous thing on the top instantly fell a crumbling ruin like the others. Leaning forward, we held the torches further into the grave. In one glance, we recognized the face of the man we had seen in the waterfall earlier that night. I scarcely think we were surprised, and when our first feeling of dread had passed away, the same thought struck us both simultaneously. Can we find the key to this mystery? We can try, said Power. Look, there's an old coat near the pick and shovel. Let us begin by searching it. The coat was fast falling to pieces, but had originally been of good material and make, such as would be worn by a man in easy circumstances. Inside the collar, though most effaced, was the name of the maker, one of the principal tailors in Sydney. We looked at each other. Shylin came from London and opened that shop about 7 years ago, said Power. So the miss must have been left here within that time. Evidently, I replied, feeling in the pockets. But here is something which may prove more definite. And drawing out a small tin box about 3 inches square, I handed it to Power. There's an inscription on it, he said, but the torchlight flickers so I can't make it out. Let's have the lantern. I turned the bullseye full on the lid of the box, and Power read out the inscription. It ran, George Woodfall, Potts Point, Sydney. George Woodfall! Exclaimed Power. Why, he must have been murdered after all. With a great deal of difficulty I forced open the lid, and drew out from the box a small sheet of paper, folded square. Shall we read it now, I asked, or wait till we get outside? Now, answered Power eagerly. He had already begun to unfold the paper, and after one glance at its content, uttered a cry of surprise. It is a confession, he said, and read on. Yes, he repeated presently, it is the confession of George Woodfall, who lived among us so long, beloved and respected. It is his own story of how he sinned and suffered. We read it together by the flickering light of our torches. The statement was short and to the point, giving few details but setting forth a crime and the long mental agony endured by its unhappy perpetrator in consequence. It was as follows. At length I confess I am driven to make the statement of my crime. lest I go mad before it is done. 20 years ago I did it. 20 years ago, on the 20th of September, now close at hand, there were 3 of them, and I killed them all 3. It was for gold. We had been mates at the diggings and were coming down to Sydney with our gold dust and nuggets. We had a good deal, more than enough to set each of us up, and a fortune for one. That's what tempted me. I don't know who they were, as each passed under some nickname. Blackguards all of them, and a rough lot, while I was what they call a gentleman. I thought I saw a chance to rebuild my fortunes with that gold, so I took it. I killed them in a cave we had struck one day while prospecting. It was a damnable deed and black treachery. Whatever their crimes, they had always been good enough to me, letting me join their gang when I first came to the diggings, and sharing fair and square in everything. They were sleeping too when I robbed them of their treasure and their lives at one and the same time. At least 2 of them were sleeping. The third awoke just as my knife was raised to strike him. He never said a word but hurled himself straight at me. I caught his throat as he came and held on. I made sure he was dying before I loosed my grip and stooped to pick up my knife, which had been dropped in the struggle. I leant over him to see if he was dead, but he had recovered and struggled into a sitting posture. His face was livid, his eyes protruded from his head, and his tongue from his mouth. He could not speak, but he clasped his hands in prayer for mercy. I flung myself upon him and buried the knife in his heart. As the breath left his body, he uttered a yell which seemed to echo for long minutes through the cave. It rings in my ears now and will ring till my dying day. I began with much difficulty to dig, or rather to hew out a grave, but at length desisted, reflecting that no one would be likely to discover the cave in so lonely and remote a spot, and that even if he should be discovered, there would be nothing to connect me with the bodies of my victims. So I laid the corpses in the shallow pit I have excavated, and threw a few loose stones upon them. Thus I left them, and came to Sydney with my ill-gotten gold. Here I was quite unknown, and for a time I kept quiet, giving out that I recently arrived from England, and was on the lookout for a good investment for my small capital. At last the opportunity came. 1 week I invested almost all I had in the Benabura mine. The next I found myself rolling in riches and the talk of the town. From that day all I touched turned to gold. It seemed that I could not make a mistake. Of course I kept my eyes open, but my luck was phenomenal. In the first flush of success, my excitement was so great that I almost forgot my crime. I went everywhere, did everything. Before the year was out, had nearly persuaded myself that I had forgotten. And then something happened that warned me I should never forget. It was long past midnight, and I was sitting alone in the smoking room of the house on Potts Point. I had a house full of companions, wild, reckless fellows, but one by one they had dropped off to bed, and I was sitting alone at the open window, looking out on the quiet waters of the bay, my thoughts running in no particular direction. As I sat, a wave of bitter regret suddenly rushed over me, and I felt I would have given all my wealth and even my life to free my hands from the stain of blood. Had I acted on that impulse, gone to the nearest magistrate, confessed my crime, and paid the penalty, I might have saved myself an eternity of suffering. But I resisted, and the impulse passed. My emotions, though transient, had been deep, and with a shaking hand I mixed myself a stiff glass of brandy and water, which I drained at a gulp. The last vestige of my hesitation disappeared, and I turned to close the windows. "Dead men tell no tales," I muttered, with my hand upon the sash. When spoken, as it were from the veranda immediately below me, I heard the words very softly uttered. "It is time. Let us begin." Burglars was my first thought as I sprang back from the window and felt for my revolver. Concealed behind the thick curtain, I awaited their entrance, but no one came. At last I crept to the window and peered out, my finger on the trigger, and every nerve on the alert. Bright moonlight illuminated the veranda, the lawn, and all down the shrubberies to the water's edge, yet nothing was to be seen, nor did the faintest sound break the stillness of the night. "They have heard me and made off," I said to myself. A revolver in hand, I slipped through the window and made a tour of the gardens and outhouses, without finding anything for my pains. Returning to the house, I went in, and having closed the window, put out the lights. As I turned to take up the bedroom candle, I started back with a cry of alarm, for a heavy body fell with a thud at my feet. Then, before I had time to recover myself or even to wonder what it could mean, sharp and sudden and terrible, arose a cry, and then in a flash all was clear to me. I staggered back into a chair and covered my face with my hands. But I could not shut out those awful sounds that echoed around me, just as they had echoed in the cave on that fatal night. I knew it could not be long before the household was aroused, and then I should explain everything. So I sat and waited, for how long I do not know, until at last it was borne in on me that I alone could hear this devil's concert. With that thought, the sounds ceased, and silence once more fell. Then, while still I could see nothing, I heard the voice of the man with whom I had had that desperate struggle. "George," said the voice, "you are growing forgetful. We are here to remind you that this day week will be the 20th of September." The tones of the voice were low and very even. I could not answer, though I strove to speak, and presently the voice went on. "Your time has not come yet, George. Before it does, we will teach you to remember. Thursday will be the 20th. We shall expect you in the cave. You will come, will you not?" "Yes, I will come," I whispered, and then I knew no more. I need not go on. I kept the tryst and passed through the night of such agonizing horror that I wondered afterward how I came to retain either life or reason after it. I've kept both, however, during 20 miserable years. I'm glad I have written this, for it has strengthened and comforted me. It may be I had written it, had I spoken it earlier, I might have been forsaken by those awful things which for these 20 years have haunted me perpetually, never leaving me, and surely as the date comes round, forcing me on that dreadful pilgrimage to the scene of my crime, there to spend one long night of terror on the spot where once I fell. Now something tells me the end is very near. One more pilgrimage will I make, because I must to that spot of blood-stained memories, and when I return, I will give myself up and place this confession in responsible hands. Then it may be that my tortured soul shall find rest and peace at last. George Woodfall. We buried them all in the one grave, and over them Power read the burial service from his prayer book. Then, when we had piled a cairn of quartz over them, we turned away and left them. Note by the Reverend Charles Power. Two ideas strike me with such force that I cannot refrain from giving expression to them. In the first place, it is evident that George Woodfall never came back from that last miserable journey on which he set out shortly after writing his statement. Why was this? Was it that going with his confession unmade, he was delivered into the power of the spirits of darkness? And in the second place, were not our steps guided to the cave that night, in order that his confession might be found, so that his long tortured soul may find rest and peace at last?